All right, y'all. Welcome back to the show. It's Anti-War Radio. I'm Scott Horton. And our first guest on the show today is Joshua Freeman. He teaches history at Queens College and at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. And he's the author of a book, forthcoming book, American Empire, the final volume of the Penguin History of the United States. That's interesting. Among the books he has authored, Working Class New York, Life and Labor Since World War II, and In Transit, the Transport Workers Union in New York City, 33 through 66. He has this piece at TomDispatch, co-written with a guy named Steve Fraser, and it's called Creating a Prison Corporate Complex, and you know how Tom Englehart does it. He's got his intro at the top and then another title, the rest of the essay, Locking Down an American Workforce, by Steve Fraser and Joshua B. Freeman. Again, TomDispatch.com for that. Welcome to the show. How are you doing, Joshua?
Good. Nice to speak to you.
Well, good. I'm very happy to have you here. Very interesting article. A lot of history here about the kind of rise and fall and rise again of American private prison labor. And in fact, I forgot, but I wanted to start with this, and then I just remembered it. So let's see. Here it is. The 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution after the Civil War. It reads, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. Section 2, Congress shall have the power, of course, to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. So what it's saying there is private slavery is abolished, but state, aka so-called public slavery, is still okay as long as you can get a judge and a prosecutor and a jury to conspire to deprive somebody of their liberty, then it's on. And that's really the story that you tell, is really about the time immediately after this in American history, after the Civil War, how, I guess, I don't know if anybody even bothered referring to this loophole in the 13th Amendment, that even really private slavery is legalized as long as you kind of launder it through a state prison or even a contract, a leased state prison. It's really an incredible thing. Can you talk about maybe the rise of, you say it was a Yankee project, I guess, maybe is a good place to start after the Civil War?
Yeah, no, you gave a wonderful summary of it, and in fact, I think very few people do realize that the 13th Amendment says this. You know, that people think of it, if they know of it at all, as the amendment that finally ended slavery. But it does have this loophole about involuntary servitude as punishment, because there already existed that system prior to the Civil War. And one of the things that, we pointed out here, which I think is not something that most people would realize, is that this was really the case more in the North than in the South. In the South, prior to the Civil War, where a huge part of the working population was enslaved, slaves were not sent to prison. They were punished by their masters, except under very unusual circumstances. So it was really in the North that the modern penal system developed as, serving many functions, including as a kind of control system for workers, and where you developed a system of forcing prisoners to work. In some cases for the government itself, making products that were used in the prison. Sometimes they even built the prisons, but also being leased out to private corporations. So when the Civil War ends, and the politics lead to the end of slavery, this, as you call it, a loophole was put in there because it's to protect this pre-existing system that had developed in the North that, in effect, enslaved for fixed terms prisoners and made them work, sometimes for the state, but sometimes contracted out to private employers. So it was a kind of system, if you want to call it, of government sanctioned or government cleansed or government mediated slavery, involuntary servitude. After the Civil War, this system already in place then becomes national, meaning it spreads to the South. And I think that's what most people think of, when they think of workers who are prisoners being forced to do hard labor. I think the image a lot of people have is the chain gang, but that really is not the main story in the 19th century. The main story is the use of these prisoners to be leased out to private companies, sometimes inside the walls of the prison itself, and sometimes off-site. And particularly in the South, it tended to be more off-site. In the North, it tended to be more inside the prison. But in both cases, this is something that, for anyone except a prisoner, would be illegal. It's involuntary servitude. It's forced work. It's using the power of the state to extract labor value from this particular piece of the workforce, the piece inside prison. So that's the basic story we try to tell. And we go into some detail about it and how it plays out, and some examples, which are pretty fascinating and often pretty horrifying also. It was an unbelievably brutal system, one that was, largely out of view, but certainly was not unknown during this period of time. I live in the very northern tip of Manhattan, and actually just across the river from where I am at the bottom of the Bronx was one of the examples we used. There was an iron factory there. It's called the Johnson Iron Works, and they had a strike shortly after the Civil War, and the company set up a new operation inside Sing Sing prison, which is not actually all that far up the Hudson River, and used this new operation where they can make the products they've been making with free labor, now using prison labor to break a strike. So this is very directly used as a labor control, anti-union mechanism, as well as a way for the government to punish workers and make money, generate income. It's an income generator for the government. So it's quite a story. It's not a proud aspect, in my view, of our national history, but it certainly was not a peripheral institution. And that's
now, in the article, you do kind of portray a situation where I guess it got so bad after, the last 25, 30 years of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century that then there really was kind of a reform. Because, of course, all the incentives, I think you talk about in the article where you just have outright criminal conspiracies by the lawmakers, the law enforcers, the judges, and the people leasing out the labor. It's a lot easier to talk about these things when we're talking about 100 years ago, too, isn't it? It got so bad, people's feelings are a little bit less defensive about, whether they need to take responsibility for something like this in the present, I guess. But anyway, you say, though, that this kind of went away for a little while. Maybe this was part of the New Deal, that they actually had some reformation of this. And then, because I think, I grew up with the idea that if you're forced to do prison labor, it's growing the food eaten at the prison by the prisoners, right, or maybe making license plates, which is, a state government monopoly product, that kind of thing. But we're back again now, of course, as the subtext to all this, and we'll cover this more on the other side of the break, but we're back again in a situation where prisoners are doing every kind of labor, but for pennies on the dollar.
Right. Well, you got a lot out there, so let me talk about a little bit of it. You're absolutely right. I think one of the things...
And you only got like 1 minute for the break, too. I'm sorry.
Certainly the labor movement was one factor, because of just like the kind of situations I was describing, that really denounced prison labor, because they saw it as undermining the liberty of non-imprisoned workers, by creating this downward pressure that, people in the 19th century talked about wage slavery. That's not prison slavery, that's free labor, and they saw this pushing them in that direction. So they were part of a movement that eventually, by the early decades of the 20th century, led to not the total elimination, but by and large.
All right, now hold it right there. It's Joshua B. Freeman. He's got this piece at TomDispatch.com, Locking Down an American Workforce, the whole history and current day, too. We'll be right back after this. All right, y'all, welcome back to the show. It's Anti-War Radio. I'm Scott Horton. I'm talking with Joshua B. Freeman. He's got this great piece with a guy named Steve Fraser, also is co-author here at TomDispatch.com, Locking Down an American Workforce, Prison Labor as the Past and Future of American, quote-unquote, free market capitalism. Good quote-unquotes there. There should be quote-unquotes around privatization, too, when it's really kind of only half privatization in the worst way, where you have all the coercion of the public authority mixed with all the private profit incentives, as it says right in the introduction. One of these companies got a contract for a prison, and the state had to promise that we'll keep it 90% full at all times as a condition. Like, well, what if Americans just stop committing crimes? Then what? We just do roundups of fighting age males anyway, or what? But anyway, so that's what we're talking about here. And I'm sorry, because I asked you a big loaded question right before the break, all about kind of the rise and fall. And you were saying that labor pushed, organize and push against, having to compete with these indentured slaves, basically, in the prison systems back, I guess, in the 30s, and reformed this for a while, and now we're back to it.
Yeah,
so I'll let you go from there.
And I didn't want to give the impression that they were the only critics. There were kind of middle-class reform groups in the South. There were both white and black populists who were opposed to this. So there was a growing revulsion of the way in which the state power was being used to exploit American citizens on behalf of these private interests. And the pressure grew, and you sort of gradually saw the diminution and eventually the near elimination by the 1930s of this kind of private leasing or private use of prisoners for forced labor. So I think, there was, as you said, the rise, the fall. Today, of course, we're seeing a lot of different things going on in the prison complex. The big story, of course, is just the massive increase in the number of prisons. 25% of all prisoners in the world are now in the United States. We have over 2 million prisoners. It's an extraordinary rate of incarceration. Certain communities, particularly African Americans, in some parts of the country, Latinos, are being decimated by the imprisonment of so many of the members of those communities. And as part of that, we've seen a couple things happening. One is the general revival of prison labor. Now, as you pointed out, a lot of that is working for the government. In my university, when we hand out blue books that the kids take exams in, most people, the professors and the students, don't realize those blue books are made in prisons, by prisoners for New York State. The furniture in a lot of our university offices is made in New York State prisons. So there's a lot of that going on. But there's also a private component, which is privatizing the prisons themselves, and there's, of course, been a huge wave of this where private companies like, Corrections Corporation of America and Wackenhut and these kinds of companies build or lease prisons, run them as for-profit operations for the states. They do it for ICE. They do it for municipalities. And then we're beginning to see the return of the private exploitation of prison labor. And that's, kind of the connection we were making. It's still not on the scale it once was, or it's not on the scale of the public use of prisoners. But the return of this phenomenon, we think is pretty disturbing. And there is a growing movement against it, which I think kind of inspired us to point out the history of this and to show, first of all, that it was once a big part of American life, but also that, people did roll this thing back, that you can intervene and fight this, which, we think would be an appropriate thing to do.
Right. Now, you're not necessarily saying that, being forced to build furniture is any better than being forced to work for AT&T or for some other private corporation, right? The point is just that the incentives for perpetuating the thing and having it get worse and worse are vastly increased when you have all these outside powers in on the game.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought that up. No, I wasn't trying to say that. You could argue, I guess, theoretically, whether it might be a better thing to have people learn skills and do work in prison and sit around with, mind-killing boredom. But the conditions under which the public employment happens tend to be pretty miserable, too. It would be one thing if you were paying prisoners the minimum wage and treating them the way we treat other workers. That's not what's happening, even if they're working for the government itself or for the prison system itself. So that is a system full of abuses. We were focusing more on the emerging use by the private sector and hooking that back to the history. But you're absolutely right that the involuntary servitude used as punishment is problematic if it's being directly done by the government or, in effect, kind of subcontracted out to these private corporations. The other thing I just wanted to mention is, this back in the earlier period was not something just done by kind of fly-by-night operators. Huge national corporations, some of the biggest companies in America, use prison labor, and we're actually seeing some of that today too. It's not necessarily small, obscure firms. Some very big companies, airlines, high-tech companies have experimented with using prison labor for everything from call centers to manufacturing. Some of them have had second thoughts, but this is not something that is in some deep, obscure corner of American life. This back in the 19th century and again today, we're really dealing with the core of the economy. And so I think we would very much hope the movement stops getting this back to the scale where it was 150 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Well, now, I don't know the numbers, but you may have saw the headline last week comparing the American penal system to the Soviet gulag and saying it's really the only thing you could compare it to in terms of numbers. Not that we necessarily work them as hard as Joe Stalin did, but in terms of numbers, and as you pointed out, 25% of the prisoners in the world are in American prisons. We only have 5% of the population of the world here at this middle part of North America. It's a pretty small jurisdiction to have that many people locked up, and it's for all kinds of things that people would really be amazed probably to find out people are doing time for right now. It's not just the drug war, it's there are a list of offenses, what do they say, a felony a day? Everybody commits a federal felony a day without even knowing it.
Right. No, we're an outlier, and why that is a complicated question. I'm not sure all the answers, but if you look at like advanced capitalist countries, we're like off the chart. There's nothing vaguely similar to us in terms of the percentage of our population that's put in jail. There's certainly a racial dimension to it, and I think we shouldn't overlook that. This phenomena develops in the wake of the Civil Rights Movement and the movement for greater rights for African Americans. It developed in a period of high crime, so there's a lot of public concern. But I think also a kind of general social meanness, I don't know how else to put it, that seemed to have come. It's our solution. Rather than guaranteeing everyone a job or dealing through public or private means with the great needs of much of our population, we just stick them in jail, for, as you say, things that many of us don't even realize are crimes or often petty crimes. And, of course, that was true in the 19th century, too. We point out in the article that crimes like stealing a pig or a fence rail were often punished with, many years in jail, and of course those years in jail meant being sent out as a leased convict to a private company. So we live in a society in which incarceration is really part of the everyday way we manage our lives, and I think we went really off the tracks at some point.
Well, it's funny. The neocons are always talking about this national greatness, that we all need a project to all work together on, like a war, of course, from their point of view, always a war. But how about completely tearing down and revamping our criminal justice system in America, reinstating the Bill of Rights rather than letting them scrap more of it, and see if maybe we could work on perfecting our own society a little bit. Think of what a great beacon of liberty we could be to the rest of the world if we were even approaching having our act together.
Yeah, well, I don't think we're any close. We're like the light at the end of the train, not the beacon at the front of it on this one. And I have to say that conservatives played a big role in the story, but so did liberals in many cases. And I think the lack of courage by many people who should know better in letting this pandering, frankly, being afraid to say the obvious truth, about how it is that so many, particularly younger people end up in jail, for minor offenses. They get caught in this system. They never escape its clutches. That, even if they get out of jail, they can't get jobs because of their prison record. They're marked as troublemakers. They're harassed. It's really a nightmarish system that so many Americans now live, in its clutches, whether they're inside prison or on probation or in one way or another. They're the children of people caught up in this system, the relatives of them. It's such a cancerous force in our society, and I think we really do need to step up and just begin to address this.
Yep, that's Joshua B. Freeman. Everybody check him out at TomDispatch.com, Locking Down an American Workforce. Thanks very much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Oh, no, great. It was a nice conversation. Thanks a lot.